Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first ever Kansas State University Virtual Wheat Field Day. I'm Erick Atkinson, your moderator for this evening and tomorrow evening's round two as well. I am the producer and host of Agriculture Today, the K-State Research and Extension daily agricultural radio broadcast, and coming to you from the studios in Dole Hall on the Kansas State University campus, the K-State Radio Network studios. Our normal slate of wheat plot tours have been shelved because of COVID, as you know. That's why we're here. The in-person tours are not possible. So the intent of this virtual event is to fill that gap with timely information on the current wheat crop in Kansas, its status, and wheat research and development topics out of Kansas State University. Now, we would also note that some local extension agents are making accommodations to conduct variety plot tours with individuals and even conducting their own virtual tours. So we would encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities, touch base with your local extension office to find out more about those. But this evening, we'll have several presenters, and of course, they're all at their homes or offices as we do this virtually, and they will be sharing a number of topics this evening. And later, we'll tell you about tomorrow evening's lineup likewise. This is, to remind you, an interactive event. Our presenters will be more than eager to answer any questions you may have. You can submit those a couple of ways via the YouTube chat or on Twitter at KSU Wheat, again, over the YouTube chat or at KSU Wheat on Twitter. Now, we'll be addressing those questions via a discussion panel, and that will take place toward the end of the presentations this evening, and we will get to those. Let's tell you about our lineup for this evening. In a few moments, you'll hear from K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato. He'll be talking about wheat variety selection with us. Then an update on the 2020 wheat crop disease situation as we find it today. K-State plant pathologist Erick DeWolf will be sharing the latest observations there. Further ahead, we will bring in K-State crop production specialist for Northwest Kansas, Lucas Haag. Lucas will be talking about variety selection, but narrowing it down to the western part of the state and the special considerations there. Later on, you will meet the newly appointed wheat disease specialist at Kansas State University. Kelsey Andersen is her name, and we'll be talking about her background and what she'll be bringing to the table as she takes on this new post and some of the special interests that she's had research-wise in wheat disease studies and learning about managing diseases. And around 8:50 or so, our discussion panel. So that's our order of business this evening. We really don't have the trucks and the trailers with hay bales for seats to drive you around. We don't have these screeching portable audio systems, which would normally feature our in-person wheat field days, but you'll find this to be every bit as informative as the conventional K-State field days that you've been accustomed to, and hopefully then some, with lots of presentations and information to share. So settle in for the next couple of hours. We have a lot to pass along to you, and we will start by handing over the microphone, if you will, to Romulo Lollato. Romulo is a wheat disease specialist, again, with K-State Research and Extension, and credit to Romulo for largely being responsible for putting this concept of a virtual wheat field tour together. So Romulo, we turn it over to you and let you share what you have for us this evening.
Very well. Well, thank you, Erick, very much for the introduction. Welcome, everyone who is at home. As Erick mentioned, during this time of the year, we are generally out doing 50 or 60 wheat plot tours throughout the state. Unfortunately, we cannot be there with you, but we're here and trying to share the same information with you. And hopefully you will enjoy the line out that we have, discussing some of the conditions of the wheat crop and variety selection as well. Today, more focused on Western Kansas towards the end. And then tomorrow, we're going to do more of a Central and Eastern Kansas portion as well. So I guess what I would like to do here now would be to share my screen here, so everybody would be able to see, and we will talk about some some concepts on wheat variety selection here. So let's see, as we see that screen being shared with the public. Okay, so wheat variety selection in Kansas, right? Again, we would usually be discussing this face-to-face, but as we cannot be there right now, we are doing this via YouTube. So the two main things that I would like to touch base with you here today, one is a brief overview of the 2020 wheat crop conditions across the state. So how is the wheat crop looking and what have been the challenges that we faced so far? And then we're going to move on to wheat variety selection. So what is the Kansas wheat crop looking so far? So during May 19th through May 21st, we held the virtual wheat quality tour, right? So again, this is another event that usually takes place with over 100 people around the state, and we do hundreds and hundreds of yield estimates. But this year, we didn't get to do that with as many people, and instead, we actually just selected a few handful of people to get these yield estimates done with a lot of help from K-State agriculture extension agents, which we really appreciate. So there, just a brief overview of close to 2,000 miles driven around the state of Kansas, north central Kansas, west central Kansas, central and southwest and south central Kansas. So how is the wheat crop looking around the state? Right, and as we first discussed a little bit how the crop is looking in north central Kansas, remember that we had a severe freeze event that took place in mid-April, and that freeze event really hurt the crop in that north central part of the state. In fact, as we move forward here, and you guys can see this picture, this is an example. You can see how thin the crop looks in that right-hand side, where the freeze really took its toll in the crop, and combined with dry conditions didn't allow the crop to come back and continue tillering. So it seems like the situation was worse for crops that were planted late after soybeans, especially in that part of the state. Crops that were planted earlier, more on time, usually had a better condition. They lost some of the primary tillers, but overall they were able to recover fairly. If we move on now and looking at some other regions throughout Kansas, and more specifically going to the central part of the state, in central Kansas, the crop was actually, that's where we were thinking we would see most of the freeze damage from that April freeze, or the April 13th freeze event. And we were seeing some freeze damage, but we were also seeing quite a bit of stripe rust, as you can see here in this photo, right? So the conditions were good for the development of stripe rust. I'm not going to talk too much about the disease situation around the state, as we have Erick DeWolf coming up here up next, and he's going to give a more in-depth overview of the disease situation across Kansas. But talking a little bit about the freeze damage that we were seeing in that central part of the state, you can see here in these photos, this is a crop that in the upper left-hand side, you see quite a bit of weeds. And this is a field, a low-lying field in Barton County, where this crop lost several of the primary tillers. We can see here that the weeds were actually taking over a considerable amount of the field, and the crop is trying to recover, shooting at some of the secondary and tertiary tillers. However, those tillers, they have a limited potential, as you can see in the figure on the lower left hand, and it goes in order from the older tillers to the newest tillers. You can see that these later developed tillers, they are smaller, their heads have less potential than those primary, which were actually lost. And so if we look down that canopy, we could see several of those primary tillers that were actually lost from that freeze event, though the crop had enough moisture to try and recover from this freeze event. If we start moving a little bit more west, right, and if we go and look towards that region in around Dayton or Lane and really moving a little bit west towards west central Kansas, but not quite that far. We still had some effects of the freeze damage. You can see there in those photos that the older leaves are essentially gone again from that, mostly from that freeze event. However, the potential is still very good, and we've given some rainfall, these fields in this region could actually result in very decent yields. As we moved west, continuing that journey west, the crop was a little bit more variable. It seemed like it had a considerable amount of freeze damage and drought stress, perhaps in some of the crops that were planted later, just similar to what we talked in north central Kansas. However, as we go west, those crops were typically probably planted after a corn crop, and they were a little bit smaller and showing more damage from that freeze. But as we moved west, now from this part of Dayton and west, again, quite a bit of variability, most dependent on the cropping system that we were actually working with. So typically fields that were planted on time after a long-term fallow period, they were in better shape, and perhaps they had a good yield potential, as much as close to 50 or 60 bushels per acre yield potential. Some of the fields that were planted late had more limited yield potential. As we continue moving southwest now, right, as we went to that region of Dodge City and southwest from there, so including as far west as as far southwest as Liberal and that region, the conditions were actually considerably worse than they were in the west central part of the state. Actually, we were seeing several fields with yield potential in dryland fields, of course, yield potential perhaps 10 bushels per acre or 15 bushels per acre. So a very low yield potential in parts of southwest Kansas. And that, of course, has to do with the long-term drought stress that the crop has been exposed to in that region of the state. So the irrigated fields in far southwest Kansas are actually looking great. They were in very good shape. However, those dryland fields, they were very short, they were stunted. We were looking anywhere from even less than 10 inches tall for a crop that is heading out, which is extremely, extremely short. So definitely the yield potential is compromised in those fields. Made you think, why haven't farmers terminated a field like this, for example? And farmers have many decisions that they have to take. And some, in this case, for example, it might have to do with restrictions in the crop rotation because of herbicides that were applied to the wheat crop. So as you can see here in this photo here that I took near Liberal, Kansas. So a lot of the story of the Kansas wheat crop in this season comes back to that potential for freeze damage that we saw from that April 13th freeze, but also from this drought stress, right? So if we just wrap up this initial portion of the presentation, if we look in the total amount of precipitation during the growing season from September 1st to May 18th, and compare that to the normal for the state, you can see that we were anywhere from in the wheat growing region, we were close to normal, perhaps a little bit above normal in south central part of the state, where the crop is actually looking very good, with a good yield potential. However, we were considerably behind normal in north central Kansas and northwest Kansas. That map that you saw went until May 18th, and after that we had these amounts of cumulative precipitation that I have on top of the map. And so it really shows you that the conditions should improve, especially perhaps in the central part of the state, but we're probably still behind where we should be in far southwest Kansas. That gives an overview of what the crop is looking like throughout the state and what we saw during the wheat quality tour. Now, moving forward to the next portion of the presentation here with variety selection. Now, I would like to note here that I'm not going to discuss individual varieties here for a couple of reasons. One, we have other specialists here, the area agronomists, Lucas Haag and Stu Duncan, are going to do a more detailed discussion, and also We have our two breeders, Allan Fritz and Guorong Zhang. Tomorrow, we're going to do their discussions on their breeding programs and varieties that are coming up down the line there. So I'm going to do a discussion more focused on the steps for us to take an informed variety selection, right? How do we go about making that decision? And what are some of the factors that we need to consider when we are making that decision, variety selection in our property? And so whenever I talk about wheat variety selection, I like to talk about a few different things. I like to consider a few different things here. And these different steps that I like to talk about, they include first the regional adaptability of that variety. Then we look at some traits of interests. Those traits of interest, they depend on the typical abiotic and biotic stresses as well, although I'm not going to go into the biotic ones much today. With variety maturity, disease resistance, which I'm going to very briefly go over, but Erick should focus on this part here in the next presentation, and then the production system. So with these topics in mind, whenever we discuss wheat variety selection in the aspect of regional adaptability, and I like to call this the bird's eye view, right? It's where breeders had the regional of adaptation of each one of those individual varieties. And what you can see here on this graph is a comparison between two varieties that are actually very well adapted to their own regions. Okay, so we're talking about the variety Everest from Kansas State University in green, and the variety Bird from Colorado State University in blue. And we're comparing their performance in eastern Colorado and western Kansas and in the Oklahoma Panhandle. And in the bottom, what we have, we're comparing 60 different trials, right? So we have the location mean in the bottom and the mean of each of those varieties in the y-axis there. So we see that in these 60 trials, Everest yielded 48 bushels per acre and Bird yielded 55 bushels per acre. Well, that's the western region where Bird is more adapted, right? If we look now in central Kansas, central Oklahoma as well, south central Nebraska and eastern Kansas, that ranking flips, right? So now we're looking at Everest out-yielding Bird for a good 3 bushels per acre. So really, regional adaptability, it really involves several of the traits that we're going to talk about that make a given variety more adapted to a given region than other variety. So that's the first thing that we need to have in mind. What's the regional adaptability of the variety that we are selecting? So where is the farm located and what are the varieties that might be adapted to that location? So now going a little bit more into the nitty-gritty, right? What are some of the traits of interest? Now that you have the regional adaptation in mind, what are some of the traits of interest that we need to be looking for? And I'm going to show here a couple of different ways of looking at this. One is a great work that Erick DeWolf has done, and it's looking at varieties that were widely adopted throughout the state, right? What were the characteristics of those varieties that were widely adopted over the years in different parts of Kansas? And we see here that for eastern and central Kansas, as far as maturity goes, usually those varieties towards to medium maturity or earlier. And in western Kansas, there was at least a medium late varieties or earlier. So slightly later maturity in western Kansas. Similarly, whenever we look at variety height, typically varieties in western Kansas were at least medium or tall, and in central Kansas, medium or short. So we see a regional pattern of the different traits of interest that we have in the different parts of the state. Drought tolerance, important in both of the regions, of course, more important in western Kansas. Straw strength, important in both regions, and acid soil tolerance, more important in eastern and central Kansas. So this, again, is looking at varieties that were adopted in farmers' field, right? So varieties that had a large area of adoption through the state. Another way that we could look at this is looking at varieties that were successful in variety trials. So here we actually had the student go back 19 years of data for Kansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. And because we had such a long historical period, we did not care about the variety name anymore. Instead, we were looking at the variety traits. and seeing how those traits were related to yield, right? And so all of this data, we're actually working with close to 100,000 yield observations, different variety trials across all of these states. And what we were evaluating there is for each one of these regions, if we look what were the management practices that were more important in each one of the regions, and how does that affected our variety performance as well. So of course, whenever we look at Western Kansas, the biggest Western Kansas and Colorado, right, the biggest management factor there was irrigation. So in irrigated trials, now the list that you see there, they are traits of interest, so traits that were consistent in varieties that were yielding consistently more than other varieties. So in irrigated trials, stress tolerance was very important, coleoptile length was important, straw strength was important, and winter hardiness as well. Now for dryland trials, drought tolerance was the #1 trait of importance associated with yield in the western part of the state. Coleoptile length as well, date of first hollow stem, and stripe rust resistance. So those were the trials that, depending on your management, whether irrigated or dryland, were more important and more associated with yield. Now, in central Kansas and north central Oklahoma, fungicide was the management practice that was the most important management practice in the region. So we look at variety traits with and without fungicide, right? So if fungicide was sprayed, medium to late heading was associated with higher yields. Drought tolerance was very important, acid soil tolerance, and a medium to short height. Now, in trials that did not get fungicide on this last 19 years that we were doing this study, stripe and leaf rust were extremely important, so tolerance to both of those diseases, fall grazing potential, an earlier heading date, and a drought tolerance. So very interesting to notice here that with fungicide, we're able to use a medium to late heading maturity. With fungicide, without fungicide, we needed an earlier heading date. So perhaps we're not only escaping the heat here, but we're also escaping some of the diseases. So moving on a little bit now for variety selection, considering the typical abiotic stresses in each one of these regions, right? So we talked about variety performance here, the traits of interest. Now let's look at the typical abiotic stresses that we have in the major producing regions of Kansas, and how variety selection can play a role within each one of those situations. Whenever we are starting considering central Kansas, and perhaps we're looking more at south central Kansas, although we are seeing this more and more in other parts of the state as well, first thing that comes to mind is low pH soils. So acid soils, right? It is important to note that wheat varieties, they will differ in their acid soil tolerance. Usually it is a resistance mechanism that where some of these varieties, they will exude some organic acids by the roots, and that really binds the aluminum and makes a more favorable environment for those roots to grow. Now, while there are differences in variety, and we can use it as a temporary fix on these acid soils, the tendency is that those acid soils will continue to become more and more acid. So eventually we will need to lime. So I like to think of this as a band-aid to these acid soils, looking at these varieties with better acid soil tolerance. So the variety rankings are available. Breeders, they typically measure it in their trials, especially in the central part of the state here, central Kansas and into Oklahoma. So again, if you have low pH soils, definitely looking for that trait is of extreme importance in the central part of the state, as some of these varieties, they will exude these organic acids by the root. Now, if we look a little bit more into Western Kansas, we have the opposite issue, which is high pH soils, right? And we see that in this photo here. And what happens in high pH soils that it can induce deficiency in micronutrients, right? Unfortunately, we don't have variety ranking for varieties that handle high pH soil better than others. Although we do have some anecdotal information from growers, and this has came about a few different times already, that in which the variety endurance, for example, had a very good performance well, shouldn't say very good, but a better performance in these high pH soils as compared to other varieties. But again, unfortunately, we're not ranking the varieties under these conditions. And so usually this information is not as widely available as we have for the low pH soils. As we are talking about Western Kansas here, another of abiotic stress that is very consistent, it would actually include drought stress, right? So moisture stress, lack of rainfall. So that's actually a stress that is common to central and Western Kansas, although more common in Western Kansas. So there are definitely differences in these varieties and how they respond to drought stress. And usually they have different mechanisms as well, right? So some of these varieties, they have a leaf mechanism. That leaf, it closes what we call stomata. And essentially what it does is it shuts down its water consumption and to save water for using later in the season. We also have varieties that have better ability to remobilize carbohydrates from the stem, right? We typically call it filling from the stems. On some of these varieties, they have a better ability to fill from the stem than others, and this can be beneficial under drought conditions. Some of these varieties also, they relate to deeper roots or roots that can extract more, either deeper roots or roots that can extract more water from the soil. And we do have rankings for drought stress, although we're not necessarily quantifying these as far as these traits that we just talked about, right? We have this information on these traits for some of the varieties, but whenever we think of the amount of varieties that we have available today in Kansas and in the region, we just don't have the quantification of each one of these traits for all of the varieties. But one good example here would be TEM 112, for example, and all the varieties that derive from that lineage. So Bird, Avery, and Langen, and some other ones that would have a very good drought tolerance, which would differ from the drought tolerance from TEM 111, one being the leaf type of drought tolerance, the other one being the root type of drought tolerance. Another theme that is common for central and western Kansas would be heat stress. So varieties also differ in their ability to handle heat stress, and this generally occurs from being able to maintain leaf area through those periods of heat stress. There's a recent research from K-State showing that both Larry and Monument had a pretty good ability to maintain the leaf area and lower head temperature in the canopy. Better ability on Larry and Monument than in Cedar and Everest. The recent research from K-State here showed. But usually we don't have these rankings for the varieties for heat stress, right? We have some anecdotal information. K-State is developing some information with actual physiological measurements here, so we can actually quantify which varieties handle better. But overall, we just don't have a very good ranking of the varieties as far as heat stress goes. Usually we say that using varieties with an earlier maturity can be an option to escape the heat, right? So really we're not talking about heat tolerance, but we're talking about escaping the heat whenever we're discussing variety maturities and an earlier maturing variety. Freeze damage, another common concern for central and western Kansas. At the same growth stage, we don't have much information on how the varieties handle freeze damage differently. But again, variety maturity can be used and should be used as a mechanism to buffer the risks, right? So we can actually try to escape from freeze damage if we can. The earlier maturing varieties, they would be more prone to freeze damage. Later maturing varieties more prone to heat stress. And finally here, talking about Winterkill a little bit, more of a concern, north central, northwest Kansas. There are differences between varieties, right? And many times these differences, they are based on the environment where those varieties are adapted to. So these varieties will not go through a breeding program where Winterkill usually occurs. The varieties that are susceptible to Winterkill would probably not move through, right? And ratings for these, they're opportunistic, right? We need the Winterkill event to be able to take a good rating. A few examples of weather events that were a little bit off and not sure that we would be really measuring Winterkill here. But November 2014 and April 2020, when the temperature of both situations really dropped to very low levels. So this really, I don't think we were measuring Winterkill there. But again, this is a type of I don't think we're measuring Winterkill there, mostly because they were very odd events with the temperature just going down very abruptly like that. Again, this type of opportunistic ratings, overall, the varieties are well adapted to these conditions. Here we have a couple of examples where we don't really have variety ratings because they don't occur very often. But if we have a year like last year when we had 20 plus inches of spring rainfall, waterlogging will occur, and we're not going to have those ratings because that's not a common concern. Same thing if you look at 2017, that we had over 20 inches of snowfall in May, right? Some of the varieties here, they responded differently, but again, we just don't have that type of ranking because those are odd type of events. So we talked about variety maturity and how that can be used as escape mechanism there, right? So again, what really we have in mind here is spreading the risk, having an early, a medium, and a late maturing variety because they will be exposed to different levels of stresses, right? You see here in this photo that in the left-hand side was an earlier maturing variety. This photo was from Phillipsburg, Kansas this year. So after that April 13th freeze, and the earlier maturing variety got dinged or it got hit by the freeze damage worse than the later maturing variety on the right-hand side. And by spreading the risk, we're also able to ensure a better combined capacity when harvest comes about. I have here also a single slide on disease resistance and how this should play a role in our wheat variety selection. But I'm not going to go into any depth here because Erick DeWolf should cover this here in just a few minutes. So moving on here for perhaps the latest part here of our talk, and how do production systems affect your variety selection? So what I have in mind here, the different production systems that we might have, they might include previous crop, like if you are after a corn or soybean crop, dual purpose system, irrigated or dry land, or if you're needing some specific type of weed control. So briefly here, as we move into these different aspects of how production system can affect your wheat variety selection, the first production system that I'll talk about will be after soybeans, right? Typically, this system where soybeans are gaining area and kind of becoming a predominant crop especially in the central part of the state, this usually pushes planting date of wheat late, right? So as you can see here in these photos, many times when we're pushing that planting date late, we don't have the same amount of time to tiller in the fall, and so we result in a very thin crop. Many times we also have a poor seed-to-soil contact because of the soybean residue, and likely a little bit less water and nitrogen available in the profile. So usually if we are in this system, like we're planting late after soybeans, a few of the important characteristics that we want to look for are definitely a high spring tillering ability. Some varieties, they do not yield well from spring tillers. They need fall tillers. Well, we want to avoid those varieties if we're planting late after soybeans. Also, we want a variety of a decent level of drought tolerance because that soybean crop, it will remove considerable amount of water from the profile. So we're likely planting in a soil that is drier. And we're planting late, so we're delaying the entire cycle of the crop as well. So we want to probably look for varieties that are medium to that medium early or earlier maturity, because remember that we're planting late, the entire cycle is already delayed. And so if we're planting a late variety, that will delay all of our operations even further. I have there a couple of comments on seeding rate and seeding depth, just to make sure that in these conditions, of course, if we are delaying wheat planting because of our previous crop that we're using, we are increasing our seeding rate and trying to achieve an appropriate depth, because we see quite a bit of winter damage in wheat crop that is planted after soybeans, especially if we don't have a good seed to soil contact because of that seeding there. The next system here with a previous crop of corn, right? It's very important in central Kansas and becoming important in western Kansas as well. Usually we have very heavy residues that can affect wheat stand. And I'm sure Erick is going to talk more about these, a very high likelihood of scab. So the first thing that we look for in this system would be a variety of good tolerance to head scab, a variety as well with good healing ability, and probably a range in maturity as well, right? Now, remember that for soybeans, we're more talking about medium and early maturing varieties. And here, because corn typically, at least in central Kansas, allows you to plant on time, using a range of variety maturities with scab tolerance can be very important because the timing for infection and the weather during the time for infection is very important as well. For the dual purpose system, this becomes more important perhaps in southwest Kansas, parts of south central Kansas as well. We need to remember that grazing causes several different types of stresses to that plant. And so we need to select varieties that have given characteristics that will handle that better. So a few of the traits that we're looking for: good forage production potential in that variety, good yield potential after grazing as well. So how does it recover from that stress associated with grazing? Resistance to pests and diseases, because we typically plant earlier in this dual purpose system. So it's important that varieties have some type of tolerance to pests or diseases that are transmitted earlier. Date of first hollow stem, right? We typically, if we select a variety with a later date of first hollow stem, it can provide up to 2 weeks or even 3 weeks more for grazing in the spring. So that's a good amount of forage production and beef production that you can have in the spring. Varieties with less high temperature germination sensitivity as well. So remember that this high temperature germination sensitivity, it occurs when we plant in hot soils and then the wheat doesn't germinate until have a cool rainfall. And perhaps a more erect plant architecture as well, sometimes being well associated with responses to grazing. Going to western Kansas and comparing irrigated and dryland fields, what do we need to look for in varieties in each one of these systems? Of course, irrigated systems, high yield potential, excellent straw strength, not too tall, right? But you need enough residue in the end. And for dryland, it becomes more important to have good drought tolerance, good yield stability under these conditions as well, and a good straw strength. And again, making sure that we're going to have enough residue in the system. Long coleoptile as well, especially for reaching after moisture. Here I have a few brief thoughts on just weed control here. And so clear field technology and coaxium technology, there are two technologies available to control grassy weeds in wheat. So if that's a common concern in your region, you can look for varieties that have that either of those technologies, clear field or coaxium, trying to help out with control of grassy weeds. Each one of those, they use specific herbicides, and so you don't want to cross the herbicides between them. And finally, just finishing up here, some of the resources that used in this presentation here and that producers have and can use in their own systems. So with that, appreciate everybody's attention. And Erick, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, Romulo, thank you. Great overview of variety selection considerations for folks to think about. And if anything that Romulo shared has prompted a question on your mind, we would ask you to go ahead and post that question either in the YouTube chat or on Twitter at KSU Wheat. And once more, we'll be addressing all those questions toward the latter end of our program this evening. So once again, the YouTube chat, you can use that, or on Twitter at KSU Wheat, and we'll be getting to those later on. And incidentally, as Romulo stated, we'll be talking specific wheat variety selection for regions of Kansas throughout the program tonight and tomorrow night. In a few moments, Lucas Haag will take a look at variety selection for Western Kansas with us here on this K-State Virtual Wheat Field Day. And next up, as promised, is Erick DeWolf. Erick is a plant pathologist at Kansas State University, noting that he was the research and extension wheat disease specialist for K-State for a number of years. He has now made a bit of a shift in his career path, but still here at K-State and focusing on disease research in plant pathology specific to wheat and other related crops. So we're glad to have him on board because he's been out and about, even though his title has changed. And he's been looking at the wheat crop in Kansas and drawing some notes as to its relative health currently. So we'll hand it on over now to Erick DeWolf. Erick, take it away.
All right, thank you, Erick. It's always good to be talking with a wheat-minded audience here. Can you guys see my screen okay? Okay, seeing some nodding, that's great. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into our program here and virtually talk about some of the wheat variety plots that we've had the opportunity to visit. Like Romulo, I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what's been going on in the state, but specifically focus a little bit more on the disease situation as it's currently unfolding in the state. So here's a few topics that I want to try and hit on. That overview I just mentioned a moment ago, some recent changes in the genetic resistance, particularly as it relates to how we manage stripe rust. I want to offer a few thoughts about selecting varieties that in the future we hope will reduce the problems that we have with disease. And then also close with a few thoughts about what diseases to be watching for as we enter the grain filling period of our wheat crop. So let's open with a little bit of discussion about stripe rust. Romulo mentioned a few moments ago that stripe rust is emerging as a potential threat to our Kansas wheat crop once again. And just a few thoughts here about, or reminders, if you will, about what the typical symptoms of stripe rust look like. You have these bright yellow lesions, usually are very rectangular or stripes on as the name implies. Now these stripes occur because as the fungus invades the plant, it's able to move inside the plant and grow within, but it's not able to grow over the leaf veins very effectively. And those leaf veins, remember, in wheat leaves run parallel to the edges of the leaves. And as a result, this fungus ends up growing in these along with the veins and causing these long stripe or rectangular shaped lesions. Now the orange color, that's characteristic of stripe rust, comes from the reproduction of the fungus, or what we refer to as spores, that are in many ways equivalent to the seeds of this particular fungus. Now, we've been tracking the stripe rust distribution in the state for most of the month of May. As we close out the month of May and head into June, we'll get a little snapshot of where we are as of today. So here back in May 1st, we had some reports from the South Central region and the Southeast, and occasional find even over into the Southwest, primarily in some irrigated fields there. As we move forward just a few days, the word was out and people really picked up their disease scouting efforts. K-State Research and Extension county agents are essential for this, particularly in these times of COVID where our travel is somewhat restricted, and those local people really stepped up and filled in a lot of gaps. So what I'm showing you in these maps are areas that are shown in yellow, are area where stripe rust is being observed in the low to mid canopy. And areas shown in green are areas where we have people out scouting and checking fields for stripe rust, but at this time on May 4th, we weren't able to find it. So primarily activity in the South Central, a little bit more in that central or East Central portion of the state as well. Let's go ahead and advance a few more days, more additional finds. And as we move into mid-May, just a few weeks ago now, we were starting to activate yet another color on our map. Here we've got some orange color that's showing up, and this orange indicates that the stripe rust has moved to the upper leaves. And remember, those upper leaves are so important to the yield potential of our crop. Anything that damages those upper leaves just as we enter those heading and flowering stages of growth, as we were on May 15, is a cause for concern. So the finds of stripe rust moving up onto those upper leaves at this point was cause for concern. Notice also we have some additional spread by May 15 into the southeast portion. Again, those are primarily irrigated fields. Remember, as Romulo had described a short time ago, this area was experiencing drought at this point, and that seemed to be holding the disease in check in some more of the western regions of the state. Just a few days ago, we continue to get more reports from that area that Romulo had described just a week ago. As they were out on the wheat tour, they were passing through portions of central Kansas, and he showed some pictures of it, stripe rust, moving up to the flag leaves, to those very upper leaves, and in fact becoming quite severe in some hot spots within the state. Barton, Ellsworth, Rice, Reno County, for example, all seem to be some of the counties that are being hit pretty hard right now. And as of today, we had just a few reports into the north central, and a little bit just trace levels being reported in the northwest. So some of the take-home messages here on stripe rust is that stripe rust does appear to be on the move, and I think it's important that growers are aware of what's going on. This would be a great time to go out to some of those variety demonstration plots in the south central portions of the state and see what varieties are holding up to the stripe rust. Some of those differences may be quite striking. For growers in the western part of the state, where wheat is maybe yet at the heading stages for some of the later planted fields or early planted fields that are right up against the flowering stages of growth, there may be some time to consider fungicide evaluations, but I really want to encourage you to be out and looking at those fields before you pull the trigger on the fungicide. I know budgets are lean right now for wheat producers across the state, and we don't want to put unnecessary inputs into the crop unless the stripe rust is really there. Now, if you see stripe rust on the flag leaf at say somewhere between 3-5% of the flag leaves already being affected, and you are at the flowering stages of growth, I would say that would warrant a fungicide application. But of course, a lot of this discussion needs to begin and end with yield potential. So these are some of the same areas that Romulo had described earlier that are being hit by the drought. Some of them had also been impacted by freeze earlier. So if you, it'd only be fields that are feel like we've got some good yield potential yet there to protect and some moisture in the soil profile that we'd want to consider adding additional inputs or in hopes of trying to protect some of that additional yield potential. Okay, so I promised that we'd talk a little bit more about some of the changes in the stripe rust population. And beginning in 2017, and then again in 2019, we started to see some evidence that stripe rust was overcoming some of the genetic resistance of our varieties that we've come to expect out of some of our more common or more popular wheat varieties. And this might include varieties such as Bob Dole or Larry, LCS Chrome, SY Monument, a very popular variety in portions of central Kansas, and Zenda. So I think this is something that, again, I think we want to keep an eye on. We maybe got a little bit of a sneak preview of what could be going on with this particular disease in 2019. And it does look like these types of stripe rust are back once again. Some of our preliminary observations from 2020 here are indicating that stripe rust is in fact picking up right where it left off, and we are finding some at least moderate to severe infections on fields of SY Monument and Zenda. Larry and Bob Dole are also showing some weaknesses again this year. So I think I just, again, want to encourage you to be out checking fields and not take anything for granted just based on, say, observations that were made some years ago. Okay, so I think it's really important to stay current with what's happening in your field and always try and get the latest information from our variety disease and insect ratings each year. More on that to come. But maybe what's more helpful here is not only for what's not working, but what is the current snapshot of, or at least our preliminary look at varieties that may be holding up to the current population of striped rust. And it does look like there's maybe half a dozen to 10 or so varieties that look like they're better than average and have been in 2020. Have been in 2019. So some of those include some of the varieties like Double Stop or Gallagher, Smith's Gold that come out of Oklahoma State's breeding program. For Western Kansas, it looks like T158, TAM114 are hanging in there pretty well. K-State has a new variety, KS Western Star, that also looks like it's holding up pretty well to stripe rust in 2020 here. And Joe also looks, which is a white wheat, looks like my slide says wheat and should say white wheat, is in fact hanging in there pretty well. I would say right now we would call it more of a moderate type of resistance there in Joe. A few other diseases that seem like they're on the move. It seems like a year for the leaf spotting diseases that we often refer to as Septoria leaf blotch. Sometimes in the past, we've called this Septoria or speckled leaf blotch. And the speckled leaf blotch takes its name from these black fruiting bodies that look almost like little speckles of pepper that are embedded right in that leaf tissue. And you can see that over in the right on this particular slide. Now, this particular disease is spread by splashing rain and usually persists in residues and can move around fairly well in the fall. So it's not as tightly linked to residues as a other leaf spotting disease known as tan spot. And when we do have situations, say, like we've experienced in the southeast portion of the state or parts of south central, where maybe they've had a little more rainfall, once this disease gets established, it can move to those upper leaves fairly quickly, as we're showing in this particular picture. And remember, like we said with stripe rust, anything that gets on those upper leaves at the time that we're heading and beginning to flower poses a potential threat to our yield potential. So I think this is something that seems to be on the rise in Kansas and something we're going to want to pay attention to in some of these higher rainfall regions of the state. Leaf rust, one of our old enemies for a number of years, a decade. This was one of our top diseases in the state historically. And we went through a number of years over the last decade where it seemed to disappear and has it wasn't until just scattered reports in 2017, 2019 that leaf rust has made a resurgence and really come hard after some more susceptible varieties. So if you remember the varieties of WB 4458, Larry, 1863, all have some considerable vulnerability to some of the current races of leaf rust and are something we're going to want to keep an eye on. Now, we haven't been seeing nearly as much leaf rust at this stage of the game in Kansas as we have in stripe rust. But we have been getting some reports for a while now that Texas and then again Oklahoma was experiencing some above normal levels of leaf rust. So we may well experience a flash of leaf rust here towards the end of the growing season. So let's keep an eye out for that. And again, check those local demonstration plots for see how the varieties and finish up in your area. Wheat streak Mosaic, I'm happy to report, looks like it's going to be a lower than average wheat streak year. Remember back in 2017, we had a major problem, major regional outbreaks. Western Kansas in particular was really hit hard by wheat streak Mosaic. This particular viral disease, remember, is spread by wheat curl mites and often is associated with fields that are adjacent to those where volunteer weed is left uncontrolled or unmanaged in the fall and through the winter months, when the wheat curl mites would then spread off to our newly planted or sown wheat crop and spread the virus into the new crop. This particular field shows a severe wheat streak mosaic right around the heading or early flowering stages of development. And certainly this Wheat with severe wheat streak, discoloration and stunting is probably headed for a severe yield loss. So this year, it seems like the again, wheat streak is back, largely isolated pockets closely associated with those volunteer wheat fields that were left as well. Occasionally, we'll see some evidence that it's coming out of pasture or waterways, but by and large, the most severe wheat streak is almost always associated with unmanaged volunteer wheat. So just a timely reminder as you head into the summer, if you're having chronic problems with wheat streak mosaic, pay a little extra attention to that volunteer wheat that may be left in your neighborhood. All right, so let's change gears here for a moment and let's talk about selecting some varieties and look at a couple different ways that we might be able to approach this in an effort to try and reduce risk of severe disease in the coming years. Now, Romulo already did a great job of talking about some selecting varieties to meet your agronomic expectations. And I would always emphasize that you want to try and pick varieties that are going to have a strong yield record. Certainly, if it doesn't produce the crop that we want to harvest, it's not a strong candidate for growing on our operation. So that's where we want to start. And I think growers are naturally drawn to those varieties anyway. But Romulo already also mentioned important traits like maturity, drought tolerance, straw strength, acid soil tolerance, and the list goes on of a lot of things. And I would try and pick varieties that match all these expectations for your cropping system in that area as well. We might then shift over, as we'll talk in a moment here, about looking at the overall disease package. And sometimes those of us that spend a lot of time talking about wheat varieties, or you'll see this in advertisements for wheat varieties, we'll talk about an overall disease package. And I guess as someone that spends a lot of time evaluating those, I want to give you a little bit more detail here in a moment of what goes into some of those thoughts, and what are we really describing there when we're saying an overall good disease package. There are some special considerations that we might take into account for that are operation or individual farm specific. They might be related to crop rotation. So if we're planting a lot of wheat into corn residue in a no-till production system, for example, we might prioritize a disease like Fusarium head blight or barley yellow dwarf in that type of situation where we know there's an elevated risk for certain diseases. We might also consider our history of fungicide use. If you know you're a grower that often uses fungicides and that's part of your normal production practices now, I think you do have some additional options for maybe considering a little more intermediate to even moderate susceptible levels of vulnerability to some foliar diseases on the genetics of the variety, just because you're willing to use a fungicide. I would caution you, however, there are situations where we can't get fungicides out. Certainly when we have extended periods of rainy, wet weather, it's really hard to get the ground rigs out and cover those acres. And those are exactly the environments where we often will need the fungicides the most. So I would usually recommend that you have at least some kind of base level of genetic resistance, or certainly not all your fungicides. And there's also a lot of growers in the state yet that are either opportunistic, they'll apply a fungicide if they feel like the disease is emerging as a problem, or are not interested in fungicide use on their farm. So that's where genetic resistance can really shine. And I'd encourage those growers to pay extra attention to selecting varieties and take advantage of some of the latest genetics and the benefit or value they bring to your operation as well. I think that overall disease package is a great place to start, but I think I would encourage you to also dig into the details a little bit. Make sure you understand disease by disease what your vulnerabilities are, so that you know going into the growing season what you will need to be scouting for, what you need to, and the time that you need to be looking for these different disease threats as they may or may not occur on your farm. So Romulo had already mentioned this publication. This is the 2019 version that we just put out every summer. Usually in July or early August, we're able to release this publication. It's just packed with a lot of resources. And there's some information about, as we'll go over here in a moment, about some of the overall disease packages, but also a lot of detailed observations about some of the disease insect ratings. Specifically, this is where the publication where you could find a lot of that information to drill down into and evaluate individual varieties, as well as some of the agronomic information that Romulo had described previously. So let me cover some of the details that we might touch on in that publication. And one of them would be that we mentioned would be the overall disease package. And what underlies that? Well, part of what I consider when we look at an overall disease package is the historical risk of these different diseases throughout the state. And we might be able to partition the state into two different regions, either central or eastern Kansas, that are shown in the blue bars in this particular chart, or the green bars, which are represent western Kansas. And if you will draw your attention to maybe the center portion of that slide where you have the stripe rust or leaf rust, notice that there's three large green bars there for stripe rust, leaf rust, and wheat streak mosaic. And those are going to be their priorities, kind of what I sometimes will call the big three for western Kansas. That I think as growers in western Kansas, if you can pick up some genetic resistance to wheat streak mosaic, by all means, you can do that. That would be a big plus for your farm to try and reduce your risk of this problematic disease. Either picking up genetic resistance to stripe rust, leaf rust, or planning to use a fungicide can cover those vulnerabilities. As we move into central Kansas, there's a lot more disease threats, and many of these fungal diseases or in some cases viral diseases are much more problematic in central Kansas or eastern Kansas because they have more rainfall. And with more rainfall, not only favors consistent yield potential, but it also favors some of these splash dispersed diseases or residue-borne fungal diseases that can really be problematic for us here in Kansas as well. So the magnitude of these bars here also has to do with not only how badly the disease or how frequently it occurs in the state, but also how badly it can hurt us, okay? So this is some of my personal experience in the state, what I've experienced over the last decade, and many agronomists that I interviewed as well that shared their wealth of experience as well. So these are frequency at which problems occur and how bad a disease might hurt us if it were to occur in our fields. So we can pull that information all together and we can put disease, rank an overall disease package as above average, average, below average, like I'm presenting in this table now here. Above average, what I mean is resistant to most diseases. There's usually at least one vulnerability that we need to keep an eye on. Average might be resistance to some diseases. There's more than one, very likely to be multiple vulnerabilities. And below average is here that we're going to flip to the other side of the coin and we're going to be talking about susceptibility. So we're not just resistant to most diseases like we were in above average, but here we're going to be susceptible to many of the common diseases that historically are very important in this particular region. So for central and eastern Kansas, varieties like Bob Dole or Smith's Gold, SY Monument, Double Stop, Zenda come to the top. Now remember, some of these same varieties, some of them have some of the resistance to stripe rust, some of them may not. So again, that's where we're going to want to add that additional layer about drilling down to some specific vulnerabilities that we'll want to consider. On the below average side, if we look at some of those, here we're looking at things that have maybe multiple vulnerabilities. So here we might, like T158, we might actually have a strengthened stripe rust, but we have multiple vulnerabilities to brown yellow dwarf, to some of the leaf spotting diseases, to leaf rust, for example, and head scab that might be much more common in central and eastern Kansas that would make this variety a little bit questionable of whether it's really that well adapted or well suited for consistent high level of productivity in central or western Kansas. Excuse me, central or eastern Kansas. As we look at the west central, so here as we get to about the Hayes Point, Alice County, Rush County is kind of what I mean by the west central, and then certainly out into the west, southwest and northwest portion of the state. We might look at some of the other varieties as well. Here, we shuffle the deck a little bit based on some of the priorities of, again, stripe rust, leaf rust, or wheat streak mosaic. Maybe a little less pressure from some of those leaf spotting diseases, so we can kind of move some other varieties to the top there. Interestingly, varieties like TM114, T158, here we're moving them, instead of being below average like they might be in central Kansas, here we're moving them into the average category because of some vulnerabilities that we might be a little bit concerned about there with TM114 to wheat streak mosaic, or another one of our rust diseases, stem rust. T158 we've known for quite some time is quite vulnerable to stem rust. And to leaf rust. So even though they're very popular varieties, they might still have some vulnerabilities that we want to consider. On the white wheat side, Joe is on a lot of people's radar. It tends to be have an above average yield potential for white wheat, and then also has an above average disease package as well. So I think the same kind of principles apply across the board for red and white wheats as well. So let's dig a little deeper. I mentioned that the publication that on variety disease and insect ratings has a lot of detailed information. So let me give you just a little flavor for that. We have varieties that are in the left-hand column and a whole suite of different diseases across the top there. You have leaf rust and stem rust, stripe rust, some of the leaf spotting diseases, and ultimately Fusarium head blight there on the right-hand side. Okay, but let's make an effort just to do a little case study here and maybe make some comparisons. So let's highlight Everest, that I remember a few years ago was one of the top varieties in the state. And I think many of the things that made Everest great were some of its strength and disease package. Now, if you look at that and line up the stripe rust, you can see that stripe rust was one of its vulnerabilities that really started to hurt it around 2012, and even though it stayed fairly popular for a while after that point, Everest would really benefit from a fungicide in above average stripe rust here. However, it does appear to have and has maintained good leaf rust resistance, some of the best available resistance for barley yellow dwarf and Fusarium head blight, and I think that's allowed it to be a very successful variety for a long time here in the state. But as its competitors have increased their yield potential, so we've seen some of the acres of Everest decline, and we might be looking at replacing it here over the next couple of years in some of our acres. So we might consider a variety like Bob Dole. We might then set up a head-to-head comparison. Let's remove some of the noise from this and focus just on these two rows for a moment here. So here I've got Everest in the top part of that and Bob Dole on the second line down, and I've highlighted a few areas with these blue rectangles that are places where we might look at things that were strengths of Everest. Remember, we said it was above average for barley yellow dwarf. To pick Bob Dole would elevate our risk into that moderate susceptible category, where Bob Dole, we said is in 2019 was looking like it was a little more resistant, moderately resistant to stripe rust. Stay tuned, that may be eroding a little bit, but it looked like Bob Dole was a step forward on that, but also unfortunately a step back on the Fusarium head blight. So here there's some pluses and minuses. You know, if we were planting Bob Dole into corn stalks where we might have an elevated risk of barley yellow dwarf, of Fusarium head blight, we might be a little more cautious or concerned about switching to that variety. Maybe a better choice might be a variety like Zenda. Remember, Zenda has a lot of Everest in its background and brings forward much of that barley yellow dwarf resistance. Should have a little better stripe rust resistance. Again, we're seeing some vulnerabilities there, but some improvements over where we've been for Everest for a while, and also very competitive with Everest on the Fusarium head blight. So again, you can drill down to these specific ratings and kind of pick and choose, try and evaluate whether you're willing to cover up that stripe rust vulnerability in a variety, for example, with a foliar fungicide. Diseases like barley yellow dwarf, Fusarium head blight, of course, are either very difficult or cannot be controlled with a treatment such as a fungicide that we'd apply late in the growing season, and are much harder to have those kind of rescue treatments as part of our management or expectation. Just a few thoughts of things to be watching for as we bring the disease portion of the presentation tonight to a close. I think stay tuned for more information about the continued adaptation of striped rust to SY Monument, Larry's, and possibly others. So we're out gathering a lot of information right now, and Kelsey Andersen, who you'll meet in a few moments, was down in the Hutchinson area and is largely responsible for the information preliminary look at that you had of what looks vulnerable and what's looking good so far here in 2020. As I mentioned earlier, watch for a possible emergence of leaf rust, perhaps late in the season as we get to the milk or even dough stages of development that could take the top end off some of our yield and productivity and portions of central Kansas. And unfortunately, I feel like it's important to talk a little bit about some of the emerging risk of fusarium head blight. Some of areas of central and western Kansas have received more rainfall over the last few weeks, and that additional rainfall, extended periods of high relative humidity can increase the risk of fusarium head blight. Now, there's a large-scale forecasting effort that I'm involved with, and many of my colleagues around the country are involved with, that's called the Fusarium Head Blight Prediction Center, or HeadScab Prediction Center, and it's all focused on helping growers evaluate the weather conditions that are conducive for this particular disease. And so this is a national map from just a few days ago, May 26, and areas that are shown in orange or yellow here have either a high or moderate level of risk. So you can see much of the Midwest is currently at risk for fusarium head blight if their wheat is at the heading or flowering stages of growth for this particular time period. You can get this information from the website shown there in the lower left-hand portion of your screen, wheatscab.psu.edu. Let's zoom into Kansas here for a little bit more detail, just so you can get the perspective here. But that's why I think it's important to talk about this. I think some of our wheat in central Kansas, north central, even extending into the Northwest is potentially at risk because of its vulnerability of its growth stage being right there at the heading and flowering stages of growth on this May 26th date. So I think a little reminder of things to be looking for. Remember, fusarium head blight infects the grain right at the flowering stages of growth or early stages of grain fill. Look for these large portions of head that are turning brown or tan colored prematurely. At a whole field level, it can look like just entire heads or randomly turning prematurely. But if you pick a few of those up and look a little more carefully, many times you'll see this large brown lesion that's encompassing an entire floret or spikelets or groups of spikelets as the fungus moves down and inside those flowers and into the central stem, the rachis that holds the head all together. One of the telltale signs that will help you distinguish this from freeze or heat stress or other factors that might also be causing whiteheads would be the presence of this orange reproduction of the fungus that we're showing here in this particular slide. So if you bend that head to the side and look at the base of some of those florets or spikelets, many times you can see this bright orange reproduction or spores of the fungus, masses of the fungus that are on the spikelets or florets that were first infected by the disease. So like Romulo, I want to remind you that if you're interested in more information, interested in where you can find the latest stripe rust maps, K-State's Agronomy E-Updates is an electronic newsletter that we push out every Friday. That's a great place to go for not only wheat information, but information on a lot of different crops and current production issues. And of course, those of you that are interested in social media could also track what goes on the disease side of the wheat crop at KSU Wheat Disease. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Erick.
Well, that's a boatload of terrific information on wheat variety, disease resistance, and management, Erick. We thank you for that. Erick DeWolf, plant pathologist at Kansas State University. Again, we'd invite you viewers to list your questions for our panel, and they'll all gather at the end to talk over whatever you'd like to talk about during our panel discussion by submitting those questions through the YouTube chat, or again, go to Twitter and go to @KSUWheat. Post your question there, YouTube chat or at KSU Wheat on Twitter. And we would certainly welcome any thoughts and questions you might have for our panel this evening. As we continue this K-State Virtual Wheat Field Day now with another tour stop, and this time we check in with Lucas Haag. Lucas is the Research and Extension Crop Production Specialist for Northwest Kansas. And as Romulo alluded earlier, we have some specifics on variety selection for the various regions of Kansas strung throughout this two-evening program, should say. And Lucas is going to discuss that very thing in as far as choosing varieties suitable for Western Kansas growing conditions. So we'll hand the ball over to you now, Lucas.
All right, thanks, Eric, and appreciate everyone joining us this evening. So it's kind of a unique opportunity for us to do this, and we really appreciate any feedback you guys will have in terms of how this went or how useful it was. So as Eric mentioned, I'm going to talk, Romulo tasked me talking about variety selection. I also got just a few comments on some management things and some observations we've had in Western Kansas this year, and kind of, I guess, the main thing is now we're, just those of us in the data business are just like you guys that are growing wheat for profit, and we're anxiously awaiting harvest. And so, some of what we'll talk about, obviously, once we get this year's results in, we'll want to take a fresh look, and maybe a few of these varieties we're sitting on the fence about, we'll learn something this year that kind of shifts us one way or the other. But just real briefly, wanted to visit a little bit about some of the field issues, and Romulo has done an excellent job already of lining this out. But of course, our spring freeze injury, and then that was really compounded by drought. And I think for a lot of our acres in Western Kansas, the drought effects were every bit as important, or if not more important than the freeze injury. But it's kind of hard to pull that apart. Specifically here in Northwest Kansas, a lot of our wheat, we after the April 12th, 13th freeze, we froze a lot of that leaf area off, and then we really struggled, especially on the smaller wheat that didn't have enough of a root system. We couldn't access, even in locations where we had some water deeper in the profile, we couldn't access that to regrow the leaf area that we needed. Drought conditions, and then planting depth, Romulo mentioned. I'll hit on that again because that's kind of been a reoccurring theme. Every year when we have wide swings in temperature, we see the negative effects of shallow planting. And once again, that was pronounced this year, even in some fields prior to the biggest freeze, but as in the, about 10 days prior to that, we had some pretty wide swings in temperature, and we were seeing some of that injury show up already. And so, thinking through, and I think this is what really made this spring freeze injury unique this year compared to other spring freezes we've seen in the state, is the fact that for how long the duration of those cold temperatures. So, for example, here at Colby, we were 11 hours below 24 degrees. And on that Sunday evening, and for a good chunk of Western Kansas, if you remember going into that, Sunday itself, the day before, was really quite cool, and we had really strong winds until mid to late afternoon. And so we had removed a lot of the heat out of the soil. And I really think that played a role in the types of effects we've seen in this part of the state. All that time, all that wind, removing heat to the soil. And so we've seen some things that in a typical year wouldn't make a lot of sense. And that is our wheat that was the furthest along, had the most growth, the thickest canopies. Typically we expect that to get hurt the worst in a late spring freeze. But actually some of that wheat has come out of it the best. And I think a lot of that goes back to those tighter canopies trying to hold in some heat next to the soil surface, which then helped us work against for how long duration these cold temperatures were. I think there's some things to keep in mind, that long duration. I've had questions about, well, what we're seeing in the field doesn't really line up with your guys' ratings on winter hardiness, and so I think it's really important, and Romulo mentioned this, even back to that Veterans Day event several years ago, and we dropped from temperatures in the 80s to the teens in a matter of hours. Even that really wasn't a winter kill event. That was the effect of not having plants hardened off going into winter. And on the flip side of that, what we saw this spring really is not a winter kill event either. We're talking about wheat that had hardened off, had went into dormancy, had come out of dormancy, and by and large, the stands looked good coming out of winter into spring green up. And then we had this very distinct spring freeze. And so I think it's important to keep that terminology straight, that really what we saw this year, it's not surprising that it doesn't correlate to winter hardiness ratings, because it wasn't a winter kill type event. The question, and actually Erick and Romulo and Stu and I discussed this the other day, and I think is worthy of you guys to think about as you're thinking about variety decisions, and that is, well, how much weight should we really put on what we saw this spring as a result of the freeze into my overall variety selection decision? And I guess we'll know more about that when the combines roll here in a month or so. I guess I'd be cautious in terms of, we always have these low probability events that occur. I think we need to be cautious about how much weight we put into that. Okay, now here's something I do think is year to year something worthy of more attention. So I've been in this role here at K-State now as an area agronomist since 2013. And I think about the number of wheat calls I've been called out on, and the large percentage of them that, at least in some part, can be traced back to planting depth or being on the shallow side of planting depth. And so this happens to be just some photos from a field over in Gove County that we went out and looked at. And even before the April 13th freeze event, producers really seeing a lot of stress in this field that he really couldn't explain, a lot of tiller die-off, a lot of differences in relative vigor and performance. And so when I went out and looked at this, and this would have been about 10 days, 2 weeks after the freeze, you could see very distinct differences in the field in terms of vigor, tiller count, and how the crop looked. And this is just one photo here of a couple plants, and I kind of hate to use this as an example. You shouldn't always believe two plants side by side on your tailgate type photos, but I can tell you a reoccurring theme of digging these plants up is okay, where was our seed depth? And that was pretty much translating pretty well in terms of what we were seeing in terms of above ground growth, vigor, and biomass. And so this is in a no-till chem fallow. It wasn't a challenging level of residue, but again, making sure we're getting things to a good target depth is going to ensure we develop a better root system, better crown health, and help us go through these temperature swings a lot better. We typically you can't see it. Yep. So you've seen nothing so far. Okay. All right. Yeah. So anyways, planting depth was kind of what we were getting at here. But again, these are the photos that go along with the narrative I was just giving you. But again, kind of something that I think is more years than not. I think we run into some issues due to shallow planting. Planting deeper does not result in that much of a difference in emergence. That's some work we've done at Colby and Tribune. Different planting depths in terms of the number of days to get to 95% stand is not that different over a wide range of planting depths. And we generally see some yield differences there. But anyways, enough about planting depth. Let's skip ahead a bit into what I'm supposed to talk about this evening, and that's variety selection. So some things to work through, and Erick's touched on some key points here already. I am going to talk just a little bit about stem rust because that's especially important with a lot of the varieties that we're using in Western Kansas. Stripe rust, I think about, a producer asked me, well, what variety should we be thinking about? My first question for them always is, are you willing to spray a fungicide? Okay. And because I know all of you at home, you already kind of know where you sit management wise, but for Erick and Romulo and I and Stu that work with a wide set of producers, it's really interesting. We have producers that are in the group of, I'm going to spray a fungicide every year. I might need even scout. I'm just going to do it. We've got producers who are willing to use a fungicide when needed. And we got producers who just say, I'm going to manage it through varietal resistance. I'm not interested in making that type of cash expenditure. So So, my first question always is, are you willing to use a fungicide? Because that really then dictates where we go down the tree in terms of which variety should be should be things that are in your consideration. And then, balancing proven performance, as varieties get some age on them, how do we balance stable varieties we've got lots of data on, we know how they're going to perform. And, we're seeing things evolve in the wheat business. We've seen this specifically in the corn industry, new hybrids come onto the market more and more quickly. And so we're starting to see that now in the wheat industry as well, in terms of, how fast new varieties are coming on to the market. And so how do we balance those new ones with maintaining some of our tried and true as well? And, I think the key message here is always to keep kind of a diversified portfolio approach, to borrow terminology from the investment business. But that's been more difficult to maintain as wheat acres for most farmers have declined, and it becomes harder to justify, splitting my farm into 3, 4, or 5 varieties to maintain that diversified type approach. But I think it's a good goal in mind to keep. So visiting about stem rust, and this is some data that Erick had put together, just looking through time. The percent of acres, this is in the red line represents the central Kansas NASS reporting districts, the blue line being western Kansas. And so you can see, generally through time, and especially in western Kansas, through the 18 survey, we were, almost 35% acres planted to varieties that were susceptible or highly susceptible, with varieties like TAM 114, Langan, and Lone Rider taking on more acres. It's quite likely we're well above 40% in terms of the planted acres here for the 2020 crop. And so that's certainly a concern. This is really a textbook history and where genetic resistance has worked really well, and we're putting that at risk. The good news is a lot of the new varieties that we're looking at, varieties that are quite promising, do have stem rust resistance in them. If we look at it by geographic region, you can see here, in the dark red, these are the areas where more than 20% of the acres are susceptible, and it's also an area that's fairly high density in terms of acres planted to wheat. So really the central high plains here in general is an area we're looking at in terms of having some elevated risk. But again, with some of the new varieties, hopefully we can take the edge off that a little bit. So moving into varieties a little bit, I'm going to break up Southwest Kansas and Northwest Kansas separately. There's a fair bit of overlap, but there's also some pretty unique fits there as well. And most of the data that I'll present here, I'm pulling it off. Romulo mentioned CSU organizes the RAM wheat database, ramwheatdb.com. They compile the data from all the variety testing programs in the Central Plains and have some really nice tools to look at this data in an aggregated type manner. And so if we start down in the southwest corner of the state, we start off with, looking just at Kansas Southwest, 4 years of data. What do we have that we can look at? And one of our big challenges in Southwest is you guys down there well know, is we've had a tough time. Not all the time are we getting trials to harvest. We've had a lot of challenges down there with drought and other issues. And so we've got a much thinner data set down there than we would like to have. But if we look at the 4-year average across 7 replicated trials, you're going to see some things, reoccurring themes of things coming to the top. If you're in the hard white business, you really need to be planting Joe in terms of yield potential. It's really, it's there. It's got, some decent quality as well. Grainfield, it's been around quite a while. Tatanka, a K-State release showing really good yield potential and drought tolerance. Langan, not always do we see a Colorado State wheat move its way into Southwest Kansas, but Langan's not your typical CSU wheat, and mostly due to the fact that it's quite a bit earlier maturing. And so that does give us, more of a medium early, as opposed to a lot of the Colorado wheats tend to be a little later. That does let us move Langan a little further south and be competitive there. And we got some old standbys in here. T158, still kind of middle of the pack, even over the 4-year average. Of course, we got a lot of new varieties coming in, so we move down to the 3-year. You see a lot of the reoccurring themes here: Grainfield, Joe, Lone Rider starts to appear because of when it was introduced. Langen's still in there. Long Branch is one that you'll see show up a few more times here in the Southwest results. Maybe we want to take a little broader picture. So the one thing the RAM Wheat tool lets us do is bring in, we can bring in some data from the neighboring regions. So I can bring in Southwest Kansas, Southeast Colorado, and the Oklahoma Panhandle. So it really cuts down the number of varieties that are across all of those trials. You know, for example, some of the Oklahoma wheats I don't think get tested in the CSU trials. Not everybody enters everything everywhere. So it really cuts down, but you can see some reoccurring themes here. Langen, even when we bring in the Oklahoma Panhandle, Southeast Colorado, Langen is doing quite well in those trials. Grainfield, of course, still in there. Even looking at the last 2 years of data, when we've had some new varieties come out, Langen and Grainfield, some medium-aged varieties still doing well in there. Long Branch here in the last 2 years and the last year, Long Branch showing up in there as well. What if we drop out Colorado? Maybe you're a little bit further east. Maybe you're in Fort Edwards County and you're thinking, Southeast Colorado, not that interested. So let's just look at Southwest Kansas and the Oklahoma Panhandle. Again, kind of reoccurring themes here. Langen, Grainfield, Long Branch, Lone Rider from Oklahoma State has looked really strong in the Southwest trials, as well as Rugged. So you'll kind of get my reoccurring theme here in terms of ones we should be looking at in Southwest Kansas if you're not already planting them. Then you can kind of see maybe some things here that are falling behind a little bit. TAM 112, Chrome, I think we're really awfully long season to be taking that down into Southwest Kansas and the Panhandles. Shifting gears to Northwest Kansas, Tatanka, a release out of the Hayes program, really good yield potential out of that, and we've seen it. Whistler is a fairly new release from CSU. I've got some heartburn with it. It doesn't have very good straw strength. I think there's some newer stuff out of CSU that's probably a better fit. Lone Rider's performance in Northwest Kansas really has me scratching my head, to be honest. The first year it did really well in the Colby trials. I kind of blew it off as a fluke, but it has consistently performed pretty well in many of the Northwest Kansas locations. Being an Oklahoma wheat and looking at its pedigree, I struggle, trying to figure out why it's fitting well here, but it has performed well. And so I know we've got producers in Northwest Kansas that do have it out on some limited acres this year, so it'd be really interesting to see how it does on farm. Avery's been a tried and true for us in Northwest Kansas. When we talk about new varieties hitting the market that I'm excited about, LCS Valiant is one that has looked really strong in the yield trials, and so we're keeping a strong eye on that. Really interested to see how it does in the trials this year. 114 continues to be proven. Mint has some age on it, but it still tends to hang in there. Just like Southwest and Northwest, we can broaden that out a little bit. We can bring in some of the trial data out of Southwest and South Central Nebraska. It really doesn't change things a whole lot when we bring that Nebraska data in. We still see Tatanka, Whistler, Valiant, Langen, Monument. Wolf, I think this is probably being driven more by the Nebraska data. We've seen Wolf not perform as well in North Central and Northwest Kansas. I feel like it's not as competitive in our environment, but as you look at the Nebraska trials, Wolf continues to be quite strong in its performance up there. And so I think when we pull this data together across the state line, Wolf here is really being driven by the Nebraska results. We've got Long Branch, Grainfield showing up in kind of the top half there as well. So as we kind of get to the summary slide here, I'm going to kind of narrow it down to here's the things I think we need to watch or consider in terms of new stuff coming out. Some of this is, a year or two older or a year or two newer than others, but these are the ones I think we need to be keeping our eyes on. Also some varieties that are bringing some unique characteristics to the table. And a couple of those starting off here with Dallas and Silverado. These are 2 wheats out of the Hayes program. And I'm sorry, I've got Silverado here. I meant to have Western Star. Silverado is a white wheat. I meant to have Dallas and Western Star. Both of those have wheat curl mite resistance. One of them, so Dallas actually has it through the WSM2 gene. It's good up to about 21 degrees C, so a little bit warmer, gives us a little more window than the resistance we're used to in Oakley, and it's not a clear field. And so Dallas and good yield potential. So really excited about Dallas in terms of being able to gradually replace Oakley as being kind of a go-to option for wheat streak mosaic pressure. Western Star has a good resistance to wheat streak mosaic and trim V. It's getting it through a different mechanism. It's got bird in its background. So going back to TAM 112, we've got that wheat curl mite resistance in Western Star. And so not only then would it protect us against wheat streak mosaic, but also trim V, high plains virus, all of those mite vectored viruses that we fight out here. So those I think are really two exciting ones to look at in the preliminary yield trials. The yield potential has been excellent. I've already mentioned LCS Valent, medium early. So in Northwest Kansas, it gives us a way to diversify our maturity range and get something out there a little bit on the early side of things. Medium height, excellent yield record in performance trials. Our one catch here is it does have susceptibility to wheat streak mosaic. And so that's where we're thinking about where we place these. Valent's not something we're going to want to put next to our less capable managing neighbors, okay? And so we want to keep that where that pressure is going to be a little bit lower. But I'm pretty excited about the yield potential and some of the new maturity options that'll bring to the table. I mentioned Whistler, being in the performance test, but I think a new CSU release that probably has a better fit for us is going to be Canvas. So it's a Denali Antero bird pedigree, which all three of those have performed excellent in Western Kansas over the years. It also has wheat streak mosaic resistance, medium maturity. I wish it was a little taller. It tends to be on the short side. It brings excellent straw strength with that, but it's not maybe going to leave quite as much stubble as we'd like to see in some of our dryland rotations. 4792, fairly new release from Westbred, has looked excellent in terms of yield throughout Western Kansas, both Northwest and Southwest. Medium height, medium late maturity, so again gives us some range there. And overall, pretty strong strong plant health package, at least when we look at leaf rust and stripe rust. So another one to keep in mind there. And then when we get into the new ones from Syngenta, I think Wolverine's going to tend to be a little better fit for us in the northwest part of the state. I think Rugged's probably a better fit for us in the southwest part of the state. If you're someone who liked Wolf in the past, Wolverine could be a nice fit for us there. It's got a really good yield record, good overall plant health package, at least at the moment, not something we're going to have to chase hard with fungicide, and excellent straw strength. And the one that, as we've seen it in the trials over the years, I've really kind of wondered where Long Branch was going to find a home at. They call it being, very broadly adapted, but as we look at more and more of the data, and hopefully 19 will shed even more light on this, Long Branch seems to, its best home seems to be kind of in Southwest Kansas in terms of its relative competitiveness with some other varieties. Pretty good on rust. For something, it is a little bit medium late maturity, good straw strength, only average on wheat streak mosaic. So we'll have to be a little conscious there. Other ones I'm keeping an eye on, but we don't have trial data. Hopefully we'll get some of that this year to look at out of our performance tests. And those are LCS Avenger, Revere, 4595 and 4418. Those are all ones that are coming in the pipeline that are pretty regarded by their own companies. And so I'm looking forward to hopefully having some data out of the K-State trials that here this fall we can discuss with you at pre-plant wheat meetings. What varieties are still in their prime time? Well, I think Chrome, Langen, 114, and Lone Rider for the southwest part of the state are still really in the thick of their careers. I think they've got life left in them yet in terms of yield potential. Erick mentioned some of the vulnerabilities coming out. Chrome maybe slipping a bit in stripe rust resistance. So those are things that we got to keep in mind there. But I still think they've got good years left in them. Ones that are getting a little more age but still seem to be cranking pretty strong include Grainfield, Monument, Avery in the Northwest. Grainfield, when a company talks about a widely adapted variety, in my mind, Grainfield is the variety that has truly held up to that moniker in terms of being able to put it in a lot of systems over a really broad geographic swath. And so still cranking along. It'd be interesting to see once, what overtakes some of these varieties moving forward. If you have kids, you probably, fortunately or unfortunately, have been exposed to Elsa, and so you know the "Let It Go" song. And so it's always interesting to get these calls and what's the variety? And we still hear that there's TAM 111, TAM 112 out on acres. I certainly think it's time to let those go. There's a lot better options out there today. LCS mint, we see it slipping a bit in Northwest. Antero, I think Joe offers some better options there, as well as Silverado. CSU's got some other new whites coming out as well. So I think its time has come and gone. Pistol 4458 and maybe even T158. It's had a tough time finding something in that medium maturity with that strong drought tolerance package to overcome T158, but it might be time that we see it right away as well. One of the things I'll bring up here, I've had more calls, it seems like this spring, about increased incidence of seed-borne disease. We're saving seed back to try and save some dollars. But keep in mind that once you start those seed-borne disease issues, those can explode pretty rapidly on you if we're not using seed treatments. And often these calls go back to, well, I've got some TAM 111 that maybe I'm keeping it for my 6th or 7th year now. And so some of these things go hand in hand. Invest in some new genetics and clean up that seed-borne disease issue in the same swath. I'm about out of time, so I won't give the demonstration on Ram Wheat DB, but you can figure it out. It's a really neat website. Wait till the 2020 data is up, and then go in there and start plinking around with it and get some answers there. You can run some tools looking at how different varieties perform in different yield environments, which obviously can be really useful. For the really new varieties, that's hard because we don't have enough observations, but as things get a year or two behind them, it becomes a little more telling in terms of how things perform. Just one slide on some work we're doing here at Colby. We get a lot of questions on last couple of years on spring wheat. So we do have a variety trial out. We got 12 entries from 4 different companies. We've got a seeding rate study out. We're going to run everything from mill and bake. That's a huge question in our part of the world. It's not just can we get it to yield, but it also has to have some quality in order to be worth something. And so we are working on that as well. I got to acknowledge my interns that helped me. We're scouting for some stripe rust here a couple nights ago before the rain. And there's my contact information. And I think I'm only running a minute behind, but appreciate the opportunity. And hopefully we can have some good discussion here in the Q&A session in a bit.
I was really, really fearful, Lucas, you were going to sing "Let It Go" for us. Thank you for abstaining from doing that. A ton of good data there, Lucas. Thank you. Lucas Haag, the Northwest area agronomist for K-State Research and Extension. As he says, you can access that data through him. His contact information is at northwest.ksu.edu. Again, northwest.ksu.edu. Well, during this virtual wheat field day, we wanted to capitalize on the opportunity to introduce to those of you in the wheat industry here in Kansas and beyond to the newest wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension. She's been on board for a mere few weeks now and has already, as Erick DeWolf suggested earlier, dived right into it and has been out touring the state of Kansas, looking at wheat fields the last few weeks and getting some notes on what's happening out there. Kelsey Andersen is with us here on this broadcast. And Kelsey, welcome to you, first of all, to Kansas State University. You've had a very calm, uneventful start to your career here, nothing unusual going on. So it's been an interesting time to hop on board, but we're really glad to have you here. Are you there, Kelsey?
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear what you just said. Yeah.
Welcome.
Okay, thanks. Okay, can you hear me now?
We're good. Welcome. We're good.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, everyone. Yeah, it's great to be here. Like Erick just mentioned, I'm glad to be here, especially in this time of year. Although I think I think my boots are a little too muddy because we've been running around the state a lot, and that's really great. I think we've gone a couple thousand miles just scouting wheat plots, and I know I haven't visited nearly enough locations. So I'm really looking forward to getting out to all the counties and visiting visiting each of you. I wanted to just give a moment. I wish I was meeting you all in person. That would be really fantastic, but I wanted to just take a moment to introduce myself and give a little information about my background, where I came from, and what I'm going to do here. And so, does that sound good, Eric? So I came here right from University of Florida, but before that, I got my master's at Ohio State. So go Bucks! And there I worked on wheat, a disease that we talked about a lot, Fusarium head blight. So my projects there looked at the influence of rainfall. So right now we're seeing a lot of rainfall here in Kansas, which is a particularly good, unfortunately, time for Fusarium head blight. And so we looked at some really practical questions around how effective fungicides are right around these periods where you have a lot of rainfall. So how rain fast the fungicides are, how long the residual life of the fungicide lasts if a rainfall event happens after that application. So some really practical questions around epidemiology of Fusarium head blight. After my master's, I worked at a company, Monsanto, in their soybean breeding program as a soybean pathologist. So that's your Asgrow channel brand soybeans, and then on some of their other row crop programs as well. So that was really interesting. I just came from, like I mentioned, University of Florida, where I worked on some projects that took that field crop pathology background and infused some data science skills. So working on how, when new pathogens are introduced into regions, how we can leverage tools like machine learning and network analysis to really predict how we can best manage them in the landscape. So I'm looking forward to bringing some of that with me here to Kansas State.
Very good. Want to take advantage of your vast experience in the head scab issue and dealing with it. You mentioned you've looked at fungicide efficacy against this disease, and you saw the map that was shared earlier about the potential of head scab being not just a Kansas problem, but a regional problem with some intensity. So you might pass along what you know and what we know about head scab treatments, their effectiveness, their worthiness, and so forth, Kelsey.
Yeah, I think Erick DeWolf hit it on the head when he mentioned that there is some variety of resistance available. And so that's usually the tool that can help a lot. It's not complete. So if you do have really bad disease pressure in your field and you have some resistance, you'll still have some disease. But you can apply a fungicide to protect those varieties that are a little more susceptible. And that works really well when you apply right at that flowering window. So there's a few: Prosaro, Moravis Ace, Carumba, and we have a nice fungicide guide that can go through some of the specifics about them, but it can work really well when you apply right in that flowering window, maybe a little bit after, maybe a little bit before, but that can be really effective, particularly if there is if you have some variety susceptibility. So again, remember that this particular fungus can affect corn and it can affect soybeans. So if you have those rotations, that fungus is still surviving in the soil. So those high residue fields are particularly vulnerable. So just one of those things to think about.
So is there, and speaking in generalities here, is there still time for an individual to get a fungicide on to protect to some degree against head scab?
Sure, in some parts of the state. So remember to read your label and check your pre-harvest interval. So you don't want to apply a fungicide too close to harvest because there'll still be some of that residual fungicide in the grain. But if you are in our maybe northern parts of the state at flowering, there is still time. So it's important to consider some of that risk in some parts of the state. Yeah, it could be too late. And so in the South, one thing about Fusarium head blight is it sneaks up on you. So you don't, like Erick mentioned, you don't see the symptoms until 3 weeks after the infection happens. So you should be out scouting. And if there is some infection, there are some things that you can do like harvest fan speeds and things like that to try to mitigate that problem. But some of the best solutions are fungicide and variety resistance.
All right. And before we move on to our question and answer session, one more thing. This is, again, more generic, but what you perceive as the cornerstones of wheat disease management that you want producers to key on. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the cornerstones, well, the two key things are selecting the proper variety and then timing your planting. So that's really important to make sure you time your planting correctly, you select the correct variety. Lucas just mentioned this, and it's important. There's after your seed is saved for several cycles, you can accumulate some of these pathogens. It's a phenomenon called seed degeneration. So your seed gets worse over time because more pathogens can be accumulated. So it's important to start with clean seed or fungicide treated seed, and then maybe apply that input if it's practical, a fungicide input mid-season. But there's a lot of decisions that have to be made, and we've talked about a lot of them. And so hopefully I can work with this team, this great team here, and we have a great team of wheat pathologists at Kansas State. So it's a pretty deep bench, and we can help make some of these decisions as we go along through the season.
I did want to mention that and noted that Erick has handed off the torch to you, but he is going to be very much immersed in that research role. So he'll be part of the support staff, if you will, that you'll be relying on, correct?
Definitely, yeah. So we'll still be working very collaboratively. We're sharing a lab, so so you'll be seeing more of Erick and the other wheat pathologists, Dr. Jessica Rupp, Dr. Bob Bowden. There's a lot of folks that are working really hard on some of these issues, and so we'll try to get that information packaged and delivered to you as quickly as possible.
Once more, Kelsey, it's great to have you as part of the team, and looking forward to working with you and hearing from you in the weeks, months, and years ahead as you take on this new assignment. And we appreciate the comments. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Great, thanks for having me.
Again, she's Kelsey Andersen, and she's the new wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension. For the balance of this wheat field day, round one, we do want to tackle questions, and you certainly still have time to get those in, but if you haven't done so, you better get on it right away, because time is running short here. YouTube chat is one way to submit the question, and the other way is on Twitter at KSU Wheat. So if you have questions in mind for any of our presenters this evening, this would be the time to get those in. Here's one, and might pass this along to Romulo. It has to do with thin wheat that will be taken to grain. And Romulo, they're asking if you think that harvest time weed growth is going to be an issue as you have been out and about Kansas.
Eric, yeah, that's a very good question there. And we saw quite a bit of thin wheat in the north central part of the state. We also saw some thin wheat in that central part of the state, in Barton County region there, especially in some of the lower lying fields, right? So it's not general, like the north central Kansas will have more fields that are more fields, like in general, more fields that are thin. And definitely in southwest Kansas, quite a few fields that are actually very drought stressed. So in some of those cases, Eric, I think we can have several complications with harvest, right? As you mentioned, weeds can be a concern. So definitely, I've seen, and I showed the picture of that field, right, where weeds were definitely a concern, and they will be on the way for harvest there. Producers need to be aware of pre-harvest intervals if they're going to apply glyphosate, for example, or some other type of desiccant there. Some of these have at least a week or so pre-harvest interval, so that can be a concern. So, Eric, I think it will another problem that we might have with harvest in those fields that got hit by a freeze damage, for example, is the different timings of the head development and grain development as well. So remember that I showed a picture with several different heads, right, from a much larger one, perhaps with 14 different spikelets there, down to about 6 or 8 spikelets only on those later developed heads. So that can actually result in considerable differences in moisture condition, so moisture grain drying, right, so that the first primary ones might be ready and good to go, but those late ones, the later developed ones, they might actually be too moist, and that can be on the way of harvest as well. So be on the lookout for more information there from K-State Research and Extension. We'll be putting out some tips for harvesting thin and short wheat as well. but definitely those can be concerned in those fields that got affected by freeze damage or drought stress that reduced its height.
Right. Thanks, Romulo, for that response. Here's another one, and we'll give this to Erick DeWolf, and it basically asks, Erick, how does one know when wheat is past the point of no return for a fungicide application?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, there's a couple different ways that you can be past the point of no return, so to speak. So one of them, as Kelsey just mentioned, could be just by label restrictions. So we might have wheat that's moved into the flowering stages of growth or maybe past now. Once we get to the flowering stages of growth or into the grain fill stages of growth, we are now off-label for many fungicides. So there can be just some label restrictions. The other would be it's possible to be too late for a foliar fungicide application for a disease like stripe rust, for example. So, a lot of our fungicides go out and attempt to manage stripe rust. And if the leaves are too badly damaged, in many situations, it would be too late for a fungicide. So the fungicides that we have today are very good at either preventing infections or the curative, if you want to use the term curative activity, is very limited. So once the tissue becomes diseased and those cells of the plant leaves are damaged, that ship has sailed, and that tissue will continue to decline. Those leaves will continue to decline. So there is a situation where the damage can already be done, or too much damage can already be done, and we might consider it unnecessary to apply a fungicide anymore, simply because the leaf is too badly damaged.
Okay. We'll finish with one more, and well, this is also for Erick DeWolf, because you have more history in observing disease issues in Kansas wheat than Kelsey does, although that'll change soon enough. How would you rank this year as far as likely disease loss in Kansas?
Yeah, another excellent question. So yeah, we've definitely over the last 12, 15 years have experienced a variety of different range of problems. So, if we look back at 2017, for example, we had major problems with wheat streak mosaic and stripe rust in that particular year. And that was the two diseases working together resulted in a major statewide yield losses. The very next year, 2018, it seemed like drought was the dominant feature of 2018. And other than a little bit of leaf rust, many of those diseases were held in check by those dry conditions. This year, I feel like we may be looking at a situation where we may be average or maybe even slightly average because of the relative absence of wheat streak mosaic in the West for other than a few isolated pockets. We do have some stripe rust on the move, and probably what will tip the scale from it either being average or above average on the statewide loss is what happens in Western Kansas over the next couple of weeks with stripe rust and leaf rust. So remember, dry conditions have slowed the development of the disease other than some irrigated fields in Western Kansas. But now that they've gotten a little bit more rainfall in some areas of the Northwest and North Central, we may well yet see some of those diseases get a foothold and begin to develop more right during the critical stages of grain fill. So let's keep an eye on some of those wild cards there. But right now, I would say we're shaping up to be average or even slightly below.
All right, thank you, Erick. And we'll let that cap off this stage one of K-State's virtual Wheat Field Day. Stage two is tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. We'd like to thank our contributors this evening, K-State's Romulo Lollato, Erick DeWolf, Lucas Haag, and Kelsey Andersen, for providing us all of this information. And we would again remind you that you can pose questions tomorrow night if you didn't get them in tonight through the same venues at KSU Wheat on Twitter or on the YouTube chat mechanism that's available to you then. And as far as linking into tomorrow's program, you can do that a number of ways. Go to Facebook or Twitter at KSU Wheat. The links will be posted there or are now. And the Agronomy e-update newsletter posted a flyer earlier this morning that's available via that newsletter. Click on the website. You can go to agronomy.ksu.edu and find the YouTube link for tomorrow's program, which will include K-State wheat breeders Allan Fritz and Guorong Zhang. They'll be looking at the variety development for central and western Kansas. Also, K-State's Stu Duncan will be on board, and he'll be talking variety selection for central Kansas. And the program tomorrow night will conclude with a look at Kansas Wheat Commission sponsored research. Aaron Harries from the Kansas Wheat Commission will be on board for that. So that's tomorrow's lineup. We hope you will take part once again in this program, a virtual wheat field day from Kansas State University. We will see you tomorrow night right back here. Until then, Erick Atkinson bidding you a good day from the campus of Kansas State University.